All right, cool. Now we have our app icon. We also have our launch screen. Um, how about we start building some pages, right, or some screens for our app? Well, which screen do we want to build first? Well, it really depends on what kind of flow we want, right, for our user. What do we want to happen when they start the app? So we want them to see the launch screen first, and then after that, we want to see the login screen, right? And then when they log in, we want to then send them to the home screen. So let's go ahead and add the login screen and the home screen. Make sure you're in the right container or the right storyboard. So go to main, which is where all the other pages or all the other screens will live. Click on your library, and what you want to do is look for a view controller. Um, and a view controller is, remember, like I said, a view controller is basically a screen or a page, right? So just drag that view controller item that you see there, drag that onto your app. And what we basically did here is add a new page. And then don't forget to do this. Just click on the yellow dot that you see here in your view controller, and make sure to check this box here that says is initial view controller. And this basically means that for this specific storyboard or this specific container, this is the page that we want to show first. On the launch screen, you can tell, by the way, by this little arrow on the left. On the launch screen, this is my screen, and then on the main screen, this right here is my original screen. All right. And then we also need a second screen, right? We need a screen. We need a home screen. We'll also drag another view controller. However, I want you to use a different type of view controller this time. It's the type of view controls that you've seen in all kinds of apps that has a bar at the top that allows you to go back and forth. It's called a navigation bar. So a view controller, just a simple view controller, doesn't have a navigation bar. We want the kind of view controller that has a navigation bar. So I'm going to look for navigation controller, and there it is. And then I'm going to drag that. You're going to see it looks kind of weird. It looks kind of like two different screens, but it's really just one screen. So I'm going to drag that and then drop here. There you go. Like I said, it kind of looks like you're dragging two screens, but don't worry about it. This is basically just one single screen, and we won't be touching this here. We'll just be touching this screen right here. This original one here just means that it's, this is where your navigation starts. Don't worry about it. All right, so this right here is our login screen, and this right here is our home screen. All right, so let's start with our login screen. What do we want on our login screen? Well, we probably want a button, right? We want some kind of button that says login, for example. So I'm gonna go back to my library, and I'm gonna look for a button, and there you go. I'm going to drag this one here that just says button. It's a simple button, not the bar button items, just the button. So I'm going to drag that. And I'm just going to put it right there in the middle. And then I'm going to do some, I'm going to, personalize it. You want to click on, again, remember that downward arrow. That's where most of your settings for this buttons will be. And this content here, by the way, on the right changes depending on what you've selected. So remember, for the image view, we had image, and for this button, we have things like title, exactly what is it going to say. We have the font. So I'm just going to click on the T here, and I'm going to increase the font to something bigger. Let's say, how about a 35? Okay, perfect. And I'm going to change the text to say login. All right, right there. And then I'm going to change the background right here. So I'm going to change the background to something like I don't know, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to go for a custom color here. and I'm going to pick something that kind of looks like Twitter. It's not going to be exact color, but it's kind of fun to try at least. Something like that, something blue like that. All right, perfect. Close that. And then I'm going to make it slightly larger. All right, there you go. I want to keep it centered. And I'm going to change the color of the text color up here. I'm just going to have it be white. Perfect. And then I'm just going to center it, make sure that it always stays at the center. Remember kind of how we did with the image. So I'm going to click on that. Other than just saying how far you want it to be to the left, to the right, to the bottom, or to the top. You can also just decide how big you want the button to be in this screen. So I'm gonna ignore these here, and I'm just gonna set the size to always be 185 width and the height to always be 54. And then I'm gonna add the constraints. And then, don't worry about the red lines here. It basically just means that Xcode doesn't exactly know where to put this button with this specific size. So I'm going to click on this other button right here that has the alignment constraint. And all I want you to do is check on this and check on that. And that basically just tell it, always make sure that it's right at the center horizontally and it's right at the center vertically. Add constraints and boom. Now, regardless of what kind of phone we open this in, this button will always be right there at the center. All right, next thing I want you to do is to create what's called a segue. A segue is basically a connection between two screens, meaning that I can then call that segue in the code, and what that segue will do is basically transition or send the user to a different screen. I could, if I wanted, hold Control, drag this button, and then just have it go here. And then select how I want that screen to actually show. But you don't actually want to do that, right? You want to be able to, otherwise if you did this, regardless of whether they actually have a valid account, it will automatically just send them to the home screen. We don't want to do that. We want to control in our code that segue and whether or not we get to send them to the home screen. So instead of dragging the button, hold Control and drag this yellow icon or yellow circle here and drag that onto this. All right. And then you want to do present modelly. These are just different ways that you can present a screen on top of another. A model is basically a presentation where the screen kind of comes from the bottom and basically just gets put on top. And that's what you want for this project. So present modelly. There you go. Now you'll notice here that we now have a new connection right in the middle here. You want to give that connection a name so that we can refer to it in our code. So I'm going to click on that connection, just that arrow, and then under, again, see where the attribute inspector here now shows the properties specifically for that segue. I'm going to call this login to home. All right, so this is basically the segue that goes from my login screen to my home screen. All right, let's give it a shot. Let's just run this and see what we currently have. So don't worry about any of this these warnings here. We'll go through those in a second. All right, our app is starting and building. It's going to take a little longer now. There's our launch screen, and now we have our home screen. There you go, with our login button. And of course, right now, if I were to click, there's nothing happening because we actually haven't written any code yet. All right, let's go back here. So what do we want to do next? Well, I keep saying we haven't written any code yet. How do we actually write that code? And this will be what we call the logic. So this is what we actually see, but behind every single screen, we'll have some kind of code that basically decides or basically manages that view or that screen. So click back on this folder right here. All right, so I want you to, again, make sure you are under the Twitter folder. And what you're gonna do is add a new file. So right click, you want to add a new file, and then what you want to add is a Cocoa Touch class. Click on that. Next. What we're doing here is creating a file that will be tied to a specific page, right? So we want a file to be tied to a login screen. So go ahead and create one here. I'm just gonna say login view controller. Oops, controller. All right. And then the subclass, you want it to be a view. I think it's a UI view controller. There you go. Do not create, make sure that this box here is unchecked. You don't want to create a zip file. And also make sure that the language says Swift. All right, next. And then it's going to confirm that that's where you want to save it. So say create. And there you go. Now we have a new file there. This new file is basically the file that we will link to our login controller. So we've created the file that will go with that specific screen. We have to tie them though, right? Because right now they're just two different screens, even though they're named about the same. So go back to your main screen or main storyboard, sorry. Click on that yellow dot again on top of your login controller, and then go back to that right panel there. But instead of looking at your attribute inspector, you're gonna click on this other button that kind of looks like an ID, like a driver's license. It's called the identity inspector. Click on that, and then in here we're basically giving an identity to this specific page. So what you're saying is, okay, I have a page now. Which code do I want to be tied to this specific page? And we're going to tie the login view controller file that we just created. And all you have to do is just type it in here. So login, actually it shows up there. Select that, enter, and that's it. By doing that, you just linked this specific page here to that specific file here. All right, cool. Go back here. Hopefully you are still following. Now we want to tie our button to what we call a logic, or to just the code, right? It would be kind of helpful if I could see this page and the code that is actually tied to that page side by side, right? I wish I could do that. Well, there is a way to do that. If you need some space on the left or right because of the size of the laptop that you have, I'm working with a 13-inch right now, so I have 15-inch, so I have enough space. You can use these buttons up here to toggle whatever section you want off the screen. I'm gonna get rid of that left side for now because I don't need to go to another file. And then how do we actually show the page here and the code that actually goes with the page? Well, up here there is a kind of two circles, or two circles, I guess, two rings right here. This is called the assistant editor. The assistant editor shows you the view or the screen that you're working on, as well as the code that is linked to it. So click on that, and there you go. Once you click on that, you'll notice that now we have the code, that login screen. As long as you select this screen here, you'll see the code that is linked to it. If for some reason your code is not showing up correctly here, make sure up here that it says automatic, right? So just click right above the code here, whatever you're seeing here. Make sure to select automatic and then login screen. By setting it to automatic, Xcode will always make sure to show whatever code is linked to whatever screen you're clicking on here. So if I were to click on the navigation controller, for example, then you notice that the code on the right here changed. If I click back on the home, on the login screen, then it goes back to this. All right, let's link this thing to actual something. Let's link the login button to something cool here. So I'm going to drag that button. Again, I'm going to hold Control, and then I'm going to drag the button. You'll see that there's an arrow here that shows up. I'm going to drag that here, right under where it says View Did Load, and then I'm going to let go. What I'm doing here is creating an action. You can create either an action or an outlet. An outlet means that you're creating something that you will change. An action means that you're creating something that will react to an action. So in this case, we want to create an action that will react or that will happen when somebody clicks on the button. So make sure to select action up here. And I'm going to call it something like on login button. All right, connect, boom. Now we have something up here. This basically means that anything that I put in here will run anytime somebody types on the tap the button. So I could write something like this: print hello world. This means that anytime somebody clicks on that button, it will print hello world. Well, it won't print on the phone. It will actually print in the console here. So let's go ahead and try that. Run. All right, we have our home screen and then our button, and then I'm going to click on that. Boom. Can you see the hello world in the console here? Anytime I click, 1, 2, 3, boom, 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 boom. There you go. So now we have an action in our code. We actually don't want to write, hello world, right? That's kind of a waste of time. We actually want to log in. So how do we do that? Well, we've already written some kind of API call to log in into Twitter. So what you're going to do is type Twitter API caller dot client. This, again, we're calling that file that I showed you at the beginning that has all these functions, and then dot, there should be a function here called login right there. All right, make sure to pay attention here because it's going to get a little weird. So I'm going to select that login, and then you're going to notice that it created this weird thing. It's called a closure. You don't need to know exactly what it is, but what this basically means is, okay, tell me which URL you want to call. Tell me what you want me to do when this actually works, and tell me what you want me to do when this doesn't work. The URL is kind of like a phone number, a specific URL that we are hitting on the API, on the Twitter API for logging in. The success is basically everything we'll do when that login works. In our case, our login will just send somebody to the home screen. The failure is something that we'll do if it were not to work. For example, we could display a message saying there's a problem, right? All right, so let's find that information. So which URL or which address or which endpoint at the API we need to call to log in? Well, let's go. Let's just open Google. And what I want you to look for is something called Twitter API, of course. Just click on that first link. And this is basically a bunch of different kind of, endpoint that you can call for all kinds of things. If you want to get the trending location, you have a bunch of things. If you want to get the, any kind of information like the tweets. But what we just want to do right now is just logging in. So how do we do that? I'll go under basic or basics, and then I think it's called authentication right there. So click on authentication, and then API reference right there. And the one you're going to need is this thing right there, request token. So click on that. And then what you want to do is get this right here. This is your resource right there. So you don't need to understand exactly what a token is and why the login is called request token. It's just how login works. So I'm going to select that, Command C, and then I'm going to go back into my code right here. And this is exactly where I'm going to put it, right? So I have a choice. I could just paste it in here, right? But I want to keep my code clean. So what I'm going to do is right before I call the Twitter API caller, I'm going to create a new variable or a new little instance that will store my address for me. That way I can refer to this whole address by just using the name of the variable. So I'm going to write I'm going to call this my URL equal double quotes. There you go. So that is my URL, right? So it's just a text that I've just copied from the API page. And now in here where it says URL colon, I'm gonna write my URL, and there you go. If you were to press tab, it will now get you to the exact same to the next space or the next next placeholder. And what it's doing here is basically going, okay, we're gonna hit this URL, but then when this works, so when we have a success or successful login, what do you want us to do? I'm gonna press enter, and now it's gonna say code. This is where anything that I were to write here, anything at all, is what will happen if somebody was to log in successfully. All right. So anything I type in here. So what do we want to happen when somebody logs in successfully? Well, we want them to go from the login screen to the home screen, right? So we want to perform, remember this connection that we created here? We want this connection here to be triggered. All right, so the way you're going to do that is by doing something called perform segue. A segue is a transition. So we're going to perform the segue that we created earlier. So I'm going to write perform, and then I'm going to find the one that says perform segue with identifier. Click on that, and then it's going to go, okay, it's going to ask you for the identifier. What is it exactly? Well, the identifier is what we named this transition, and I think we named it login to home. There you go. Then I'm going to press tab again, and that's going to go, okay, what's the sender? The sender is basically who am I going to say that this transition or this transition is coming from? It doesn't matter here, so just write self. All right, perfect. And then every now and then you can see that there's a warning there. Every now and then, depending on where you're writing your code, Xcode is going to ask that you start your line with, or you start your variable or certain actions with the word self. So if you see a warning like this where it goes, use self to make blah, 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 just write self here, dot, and then whatever you were trying to write. So now we have self.perform segue with the identifier that we created earlier, and the sender is self. Okay, now tab one more time. Now it's going to highlight the last part. And this basically means, okay, if this failed, what do you want us to do? Again, I'm going to press enter, and then I'm going to press enter again and go where it says code. I'm going to delete that code, and I'm going to go, okay, you probably just want to display or print a message, right? So something like could not log in. There you go. And that's it. We've built our login system. So what's going to happen here? We have this entire action here that is linked to this button. And what basically that does is once we click on the button, we create this new variable here that has the URL from our API right there. And then we then call our API caller with that URL right here that we created. And then if that works, then we perform our transition or perform our segue that is called login to home. And if it doesn't work, then we just print could not log in. All right, let's test that. So I'm going to press play. Build succeeded. We should see our launch screen and then our login screen. And once I click on that, boom, it's going to take us through the entire process of logging in. If you're not logged in, or if this is the first time you do this, it's actually going to ask you for a username and password of the Twitter account you're using. And then I'm going to click authorized here, or authorize app. It's going to go, okay, open Twitter. Yes, open. and boom, now we are on our home page. As you can see, it's empty again because we haven't actually written anything. But remember that bar I was telling you about? The reason why we drag that special navigation controller, it's to have access to this specific bar here and some kind of a table like this where we'll be, in this case, we'll be showing all our tweets. All right. So I know that was a long video, but hopefully you guys learned a lot here. So what we've done is created a login controller. We've called our API for the first time. We've called it at a specific endpoint or a specific address that handles login. And then we've told our code what to do when the login works. Perform this here. And we've told it what to do when the login fails.